David Stephen Jacoby, who's a supply chain expert and educator, teaching graduate operations at University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School of Business, as well as New York University Stern School of Business and the Tandem School of Engineering. He's currently the managing director of the Boston Strategies International. David's an expert in tariffs and trade negotiations, and he's going to share some valuable insights into the current state of global trade and its impact on supply chains. Welcome, David.
Thank you, Abe. It's great to be here.
Quite a bit to unravel here with tariffs. This is some almost every day we're having to turn on the news to find out what the current status is. So from your perspective, give me a sense of what the current state of the tariffs and the trade negotiations are.
I guess you could characterize it as suspension or suspense. We're kind of in the middle, I think, of the long process. The administration launched a variety of initiatives back in February or March. Now, I think you could roughly say it had about a 6-month timeline to some sort of important agreements or conclusions. And we're about 3 months into it. So right now, I think we have a lot of kind of back office discussions going on with China and with the UK and the EU and other countries, and we're kind of about halfway there. That's my impression.
It's interesting. The strategies have changed, as you're indicating, over time, or even the decisions in terms of what the tariffs are going to be and the amounts and what specific sectors are going to change. Do you believe that we're still having the same strategy today, or are the discussions on the different outcomes that we're trying to achieve?
Well, that raises that's a loaded question, because it raises the question, what was the strategy in going? And I think there was some uncertainty about that. There was a lot of discussion that recently at a Columbia conference that I was at on energy. A lot of people were questioning, is the goal to create jobs in the United States? Is the goal to reduce the trade deficit? Is the goal to create a stronger competitive advantage for the United States? Is the goal to rebalance to reduce non-tariff barriers? There were so many coincidental or confused or mixed goals in the beginning that it was hard to say. I think if you take that as all of the above were the goals, then the negotiations that are going on, some of those goals may have been diminished by now. For example, and we may be more focused. And I would say the more focused, like you take, for example, the EU, we might have gone in saying that the trade deficit was the big issue. And I wouldn't be surprised if it kind of resolves around non-tariff barriers and entry to the market in certain sectors like automotive and toys and entertainment. And then with China, if the goal in the beginning was all of the above, I think, and this is my own perception, that the goal will end up kind of going toward foreign direct investment of Chinese companies in the United States, IP licensing, and a couple other areas, rather than the overall trade deficit. I think the trade deficit was an ingoing kind of a blitzkrieg approach that wasn't realistic, but we may end up somewhere in between. And then with Canada and Mexico, that's another story.
It's interesting because let's talk about the responses from the different countries. As you're pointing out, we're seeing different strategies on different parts of the supply chain, whether we're talking about China or we're talking about, as you indicated, Canada or Mexico. We're expecting different, outcomes or different, responses. From your perspective, what are the key sectors that are most affected? Now, we know there are different regions and different tariffs, but what are the sectors that we're looking at that are most affected right now?
Very interesting question, because a priori we would have looked at the tariff structures and assumed that the biggest sectors might have been steel and aluminum, which have always been protected sectors and had 10+% tariffs, maybe 30-50% tariffs in order to protect those sectors. But actually, those sectors are, it's a little bit like farming is to the EU. They sort of have to go on the table in the beginning because they represent volume and tonnage and jobs and things, but they're not really the strategic sectors. For example, critical minerals, rare earths, and high-tech products, semiconductors, these are all like must-have sector. And so they really are legitimately essential for national defense. I mean, some of the rare earths are the only way the missile systems work. And and some of the some of the semiconductors are the only way the cars are made these days, unless you want to revert back to the sort of a Skoda Eastern European car kind of approach. We've really advanced the state of the automotive industry with the use of some high-powered magnets in all the motors and things like that. So those are strategic, and also medical, healthcare. We found that out during COVID with the masks and the ventilators and the other things. So I think we're seeing the industries or the sectors actually shift a little bit as we get into it. And it's another case where I think we'll see a sort of a resolving or a resolution of this. We might have gone in talking about steel, talking about automotive with Mexico, but essentially, I think as we look at the end, I wouldn't be surprised if the end, really the meaty, very important changes have a lot to do with these strategic sectors.
Yeah, interesting you point that out because for our purposes in the U.S., we talk about national defense and national security. We talk about silicon chips. We talk about, APIs for our medicine. We talk about, lithium for the EV batteries, and we talk about those are critical to us. And yet, when we go to different parts of the world, we see that food is in their national security and their national defense. So it's an uneven playing field in terms of what we believe, what's in our national security and our national defense. So how do we balance this global need that we rely on different parts or different partners across the globe, and they depend on us for our products and services, specifically agricultural? So how do we balance that need, as you indicated before? Is it trade imbalances, or what are we trying to achieve in terms of our national defense and our national security relative to our trading partners?
So I would say there are two strata there. That certain categories of products that are needed for almost every country these days. I mean, this is why Taiwan and Taiwan Strait and semiconductors are such headline news that also intertwine with geopolitical and military discussions, because the semiconductors are just so essential to the smart economy. They're in our vacuum cleaners and our cars and our phones, and pretty much our entire IT strategy and economic trajectory is built on having them almost in everything. I mean, if I could only have a few extra in my brain right now, I'd probably talk a lot smarter, right? And I think it'll happen. Have you seen Mission Impossible lately, right? So I think we're going there. So semiconductors are sort of one of those essentials that I think every country is hoping will have some free trade element to it. Now, on the other hand, you mentioned agriculture. Agriculture is very important to Europe, but in my opinion, now I've lived in Europe and I spent a lot of time there. Uh, I don't think agriculture is essential to their national security. I think it's essential to their national lifestyle. I mean, there is a very, very deeply embedded um, farming culture and a culture around organic food and farmland and land in general, right? So the way land is divided, and it's sort of a part of the fabric of society. So I don't think it's a national defense issue, which is, I think, where you started off, but I think it's a national culture issue, which does play as importantly for them as national defense, almost, right? If you talk about taking the wine away from the French, you're in for a war. And then if you go to countries like Vietnam and Thailand and Malaysia, then you could and well, take rice in Cambodia. I mean, you are talking about essential goods
Yep.
for agriculture. So it does depend on the country, and that's why it was kind of interesting to see the original Liberation Day list of countries who, most people probably didn't know we could levy tariffs against 180 countries at once, and well, there we are.
Interesting. Let's go to the other end of the spectrum and potential outcomes, specifically the impact on prices and availability.
Right.
I'm starting to see some impact on that already. We just recently did a study back in March, and our research indicated 65% of the companies indicated that they plan to pass those costs on to the consumer. What are you hearing from the companies in terms of absorbing the costs or passing them on?
Well, I hear one thing, but I know another. So I'm hearing that some companies are choosing to and others aren't, which kind of roughly coincides with the 65% kind of a number. Most what I know from prior experience, and I do teach this kind of, and I've given a lot of webinars on sort of the how to manage price risk in the supply chain. When push comes to shove, companies will pass through whatever they can pass through.
Mhm.
And in reality, I think the companies that say that they are going to absorb it are lying,
Mhm.
essentially. I just don't think there's a good shareholder value justification or rationale for absorbing cost increases that managing directors can legitimately pass on. And so where that leads is inflation. Not only will they pass it on, but if you get into an inflationary cycle, they will pass on a little more to be
Yeah.
sure that they're covered during the next quarter, during the next 6 months, during the next earnings call. They don't come up short. So I worked in Brazil during hyperinflation,
Mhm.
and I used to get my expense reimbursement in cash. And
Yeah.
in the beginning, it was a few notes that fit in my wallet. And about 4 or 5 months into the assignment there, it was a briefcase full of cash that I used to take to the counter to get exchanged. So that's the way it
Immediately.
works. And my role was to negotiate the price increases with the suppliers. And what happens is some suppliers would put in for a firm 4 to 6% a month, and then they would increase it a little bit each month, like 8, 9% based on some index. And other suppliers would just say 3 months went by and you wouldn't hear from them and then come back and say, oh, we're increasing our prices 78%. And I think what happens is that once you establish an irregularity
Yeah.
in the cycle and in the amounts of price inflation, it leads to a sort of confusion and then a free-for-all. And people just say, I'm going to take whatever I can get away with. And so what we need urgently to avoid in the United States and probably other countries with the way this is going, but especially the United States, is the temptation for companies to go for a free for all because they just don't know and they want to protect themselves and CYA.
It's interesting. You point out some really key aspects of it that we experienced during the pandemic. The concept of scarcity, availability of goods. We saw that in the recession back in 0809, the supply and demand issue in terms of availability of goods. This is not a supply and demand issue. This is a pricing issue that we're dealing with here, but yet we're seeing some of the bullwhip effects that we experienced during the pandemic. So help me unravel some of the impact that the consumers are facing right
Right.
now, as you're talking about when you experienced that in Brazil. How are the consumers addressing that today when they're seeing sort of this, availability is here, tomorrow it's not?
Well, I live in Manhattan, right? And let me just a couple examples for anybody who knows Manhattan kind of knows this is one of the highest price areas in the country. And what I've observed, so you talk about consumers. So I'll tell you what my shoe repair costs, and I'll tell you what the lunch costs, and I'll tell you what my milk costs. And those those small prices costs for me have gone up a lot. You know, a shoe shine, which cost $10 a few months ago, just cost $15, right?
Yeah.
A shoe. So you look at the small percent as a percentage increase, that's a 50% increase,
Yeah.
right? So it's small change,
Right.
but it's a big percent increase. And I think that we'll see a lot of that kind of changes in small things, which will bump up the overall level. Now, I also was asked recently to put out a forecast for the inflation level for this year, because if you're signing contracts, you need to
Yeah.
anticipate what is inflation going to be in October, November, December. And most companies have to sign year-long contracts, if not 3 year long. With a 3 year long contract, you probably have a price indexation clause in there and et cetera. But with a 1 year contract, you usually don't. So you have to say, where is inflation going to go? And then you start decomposing it. If it's automobiles, then you figure out the percentage of steel and the amount that steel might increase and the percentage of other things and the amount they might increase. And then you're up into at least a few percent inflation overall, at least, depending on how you project the outcome. And if you're talking about some service, then that's another issue. And we haven't yet talked about services.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. It's one of those industries that hasn't been hit by the tariffs yet, specifically by the other countries. It's a large part of our GDP in terms of what we provide to other countries is our service sector, education, consulting. And again,
Yeah.
let's hope that it continues on this way. But let's dig in a little bit on the short-term, long-term impact of this, because you're describing some of the price impacts, and we tend not to see the prices come down when the tariffs come off. We tend to see the stability on the prices at that level.
Right.
In the short term, what are the specific challenges that we're facing on, the cost and inventory, and then compare that to what we're facing in the long term, under supplier relationships, under pressure. Give me a sense of what we should pay attention to in the short term, and what do we need to pay attention to in the long term.
In the short term, we're still dealing with the traditional economics of inventory, which is basically what's your carrying cost and what's your amount of inventory and what was your purchase price for that inventory. So that's the same old FIFO, LIFO kind of a reasoning that we've always had. There's a lot of pressure that the Trump administration is putting on the Fed to maintain low interest rates, because I think the Fed has an inclination to raise rates to prevent inflation. So there's some political pressure right now to keep interest rates low, and that will keep our inventory and our costs fairly contained in the near future, while all these negotiations are going on. But I think there's a time fuse on all of this. And I would say it's roughly 6 months, because if there's chaos and confusion in September, votes are going to swing the other way. Consumers are going to be dissatisfied. Businesses are going to be really uncertain and you'll see that would not, if that's the case, they would not make commitments to invest in the United States factories. They would not buy capital goods because they wouldn't be sure of the prices in the future and the taxes. There has to be some countervailing benefit, at least, which means the big tax bill. And I think that's what's going to happen. We're going to have the big tax bill provide relief on taxes, which is going to offset the cost of the tariffs. They will basically take the edge off of the pain of inflation. And so there will be inflation. I think there will be inflation as a result of all of this. And I think that's at least going to be 3% for the year. And if things go crazy, it could be double that.
Interesting point. Let me dig into that a little bit, specifically on the timing, on the time horizons that we're talking about here. In the long term, supplier relationships we develop, and we espouse that you ought to have committed relationships, long-term trust-based, vendors that you've qualified. And we're in an environment where it's extremely difficult to make a long-term investment today, because I don't know what the rules are going to be 2 to 3 years from now based on what I'm facing today. And yet the financial sector and your private equity and your shareholders demand quarter by quarter results. And yet we're in an environment where planning horizons have shrunk significantly. If it was a year, it's probably 6 months now. Tell me the life of the supply chain professional and his counterparts in the organization in terms of what are they talking about when they say long term today.
Right.
Give me a sense of what they're talking about.
You might not like this answer, but I think the answer depends on what type of company you're talking about. If you're talking about a company that is smaller, mid-size in nature, a long-term agreement being a year or 2 or 3, they're just going to stand still. Just don't do anything, because it's the risk of making a mistake could mean you would have severe financial consequences for making a wrong assumption in your. And my company just finished a project for a servicing company for engines and turbines, for example, and or global. And one of the questions was, what's going to happen to tariffs and trade restrictions in Asia, and should we acquire a company? And if we're going to acquire a company, should it be an Asian company or a European company or an American company? And the acquisition strategy depended on the assumptions of the political forecast. So in that case, if you make the wrong decision, it's really, really devastating. But I think what's happening right now in the long-term agreements The focal focus of attention, I think, behind the scenes is particularly on your big state-owned companies
Mm.
around the world that have enormous money to invest. And I think that's where the long-term agreements are focused right now in terms of governmental activity. Your CATLs in China, the battery manufacturer, your Qatari gas companies, your UAE investors, your different Saudi private wealth and investment companies, European national champions like previously Alstom and others, that we used to be, and Airbus and others that really have a lot of weight. And for those companies, the long-term agreements means like, 8 to 10 years in terms of like aircraft backlog and
Right.
stuff. And I think that's where a lot of the negotiation is trying to be about. Now, turning back to your more normal companies, your day-to-day companies like most of us work at, for those, the long-term agreements, the is probably still more important than ever. I would stay very focused on long-term agreements. Don't get transactional because of all the transactionally sounding things that are going on around us. Stay focused on long-term agreements in the fundamental interest of both parties and structure the agreements like good framework agreements with all the levers and means of coordination and cooperation and price adjustments and other things. Go at it together. And I think everybody's going to hold together that way. It's like creating a raft in a volatile ocean, right? You raft together
Yeah.
and you can survive the ocean. And I think that's the way most companies should react. In fact, I've written a lot on transactionary versus strategic partnership supply agreements. There is definitely something to say for both, and there are some companies that are primarily transaction focused
Yep.
and others that are long-term agreement focused. But I've looked at the economics of it and written about it, and I really believe that the economics of long-term agreements are beneficial in the long run. It's just sort of a natural economic law that we're better off when we cooperate.
It is an interesting point that you point out, the sea of turmoil that we're facing today. It used to be the supply chain professionals were never called upon unless there was a problem. Well, I think we've got a laundry list of issues for them to address today. So give me a sense of how companies are adjusting their sourcing strategies. You talked about dig into a little bit more about this transactional versus the strategic, because I think that's where a lot of companies right now are really, challenged in terms of, which way do I go? We saw this back in the pandemic. We did a study with the Economist, the intelligence unit, in terms of how companies are responding. And it was evenly split. 50% said, get me back to prior to the pandemic. I was efficient, I just in time, I
Mhm.
had reasonable prices, availability of goods. The other half said, we're never going back. We are going to fundamentally change what we do and how we operate our supply chains. And it's a 50-50 split. Give me a sense of the sourcing strategies right now. Are they more transactional or are they more strategic?
What I'm seeing is that most companies are looking at this as a strategic shift. If
Mm.
it's not the Trump administration policy, it's going to be the next administration policies, and none of them are going to be very favorable toward China in the near future, specifically. And they're not all going to be as antagonistic towards some of our traditional trading friends like the EU, Canada, and Mexico. But most companies are trying to relocate their sourcing operations. So strategically, most frequently heard of, that results in a shift from China to other Southeast Asian nations. And I guess I could say that with a little bit of a rib here, that we probably would be better off right now if the United States had actually entered into the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which we opted out of, because now a lot of the most companies that I know are actively evaluating Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand as options for manufacturing in Asia at lower cost and still with pretty good infrastructure. Now, are there companies that are transactional? Very short term, maybe, but most companies, I think, and now transactional might apply a little bit more to the North American scenario, where you've got the ability to source, let's say, from Canada or from the United States, northern states. Maybe you would shift some business in the short term because you think that you can avoid a 50% tariff, or you maybe just have to because like the Canadian government has pulled US liquor off its shelves. And so if you're selling liquor, you have to be transactional. You just can't, you don't have a choice. You wake up, you look in the mirror, and you've got to change, you know.
It's dig into a little bit more on the long term, and this is one of the areas that we've seen a little bit less news on, and that's ESG and sustainability. Seems to have taken a little bit of a back seat relative to trade negotiations and everything else. Are companies still focused on it and they're just not talking about it, or are they pausing right now?
Abe, I think that's the understatement of the year. ESG has taken the biggest pummeling I've ever seen happen in a short period of time. I taught a year or two ago, a sustainable supply chain management course at NYU Stern. And I teach two courses, actually. One is called Decarbonizing Global Supply Chains, and the other one is called, I don't know what it's called, something like that. And actually, the joke I was telling my friends, I don't know what I'm going to teach this fall because how many students are going to sign up for a decarbonization class, and one of them joked, well, you could just, you could rename it to Drill Baby Drill. And then I was talking to another friend who said, no, no, I have an easier solution. Just call it recarbonizing global supply chains, and everything will be okay. So, now that being said, it's kind of a joke, right? So the younger generation is still very intensely committed to saving the planet and to social justice and ESG and all that. So you really are not going to, you can stop that by changing the language of bills coming out of Washington, but you can't change the sort of the people's innate desire to accomplish something. So there's definitely been a rollback in everything woke, and ESG could be considered part of wokeism. Now, ESG, I divide into E and SG.
Mhm.
So for me, E is different than SG: environmental concerns, sustainability, decarbonization, climate change. That's a whole topic. And then you've got the SG part, which is more about the social equity and the governance part, and I think that's where DEI fits. So I think that the E part will actually still continue as very important for a very long time. And there's a lot of technology that comes in. So it becomes a technology discussion for me. It's about clean fuels, it's about chemistry, it's about battery technologies, it's about fusion, nuclear fusion. All those topics are very scientific and very leading edge. And that's where China actually has a huge advantage. So I don't think the E in the ESG is going anywhere. I think it's going to become more and more of an issue over time. Now, the S and G, which is where the wokeism and the backlash came, is is up for grabs. And I wrote a little bit about this in my book, Trump, Trade, and the End of Globalization. And I think the SG part, and especially the compliance requirements in the United States for doing business as a business here, are still very burdensome. And that is what DOGE was trying to address. That is what the Trump 1 and 2 administrations were trying to do by cannibalizing or stripping the EPA out of a lot of its power. The United States is still a very compliance burdensome place to do business compared to other countries. So I think the S and G part will definitely take a permanent sort of pushback.
It's interesting because in some respects, as industries, we let down. We had an opportunity to establish what those metrics or accountabilities or reporting requirements are, and yet we held back because we couldn't agree, even within the industry, what would be the most effective and appropriate reporting. EU seems to be a little bit ahead of us in terms of some of the reporting, whether EUDR or some of the other requirements. Is it becoming a compliance checklist that we've seen with other policy regulatory issues? Or are we seeing some organizations truly embrace the sustainability and circularity?
Well, the United States has a totally different mindset than Europe, and we always have when it comes to regulation.
Yeah.
I use the example of the European regulation called REACH, which is a chemicals regulation. And essentially, that's a good example because essentially what it requires is companies to become accountable for the social, economic, and particularly toxic chemical kind of aspects of whatever it buys or makes up and down the supply chain from end to end. So they're not allowed, even if their part of the value chain is just mixing and reselling, they're responsible to account. They're not allowed to sell it if it's considered toxic later on in the supply chain or earlier on in the supply chain. So life cycle approach. And so Europe kind of takes this preventive approach. They won't allow you to sell it unless you can prove that it's safe. Whereas the United States has always taken the other approach. I mean, let it go to court, see how many people die, and then decide based on the cost of a life and the benefit of the product, whether or not we all agree that it should be banned or regulated. So I think that this has a very different impact in Europe than the United States.
It's interesting when you talk about, sort of the requirements and reporting requirements, especially on scope 3, which requires you to have complete visibility into your extended supply chain, which we know has been a challenge for almost every organization. And we saw it rear its ugly head during the pandemic, where most of the disruptions occurred in their, extended tiers. We're talking about, you referenced before, the small and medium-sized organizations that don't have the resources, they don't have the talent or the same security protocols. Are we creating a different problem through the technology solution of that visibility for the prime by extending that, their technology solution to small and medium-sized organizations that don't have the same protocols that the prime does? And we're seeing ransomware and cyber attacks on a lot of organizations right now, specifically on their supply chains, knowing that that can really cripple a company. So, give me a sense of how organizations are addressing that visibility and transparency issue with their extended supply chain, but yet we're still a little bit hamstrung today.
It's a great question. The very short answer is the companies. What technology? A lot of companies don't have a technology for actually reporting scope 3 emissions, and this is why I have led several capstone thesis projects of some of my students in their graduate programs on how to deal with scope 3 emissions. And one of our clients right now, we're doing some work on scope 3 emissions technologies for counting and capturing scope 3 emissions for large companies. So notably, all of the US regulations for scope 3 emissions reporting only apply to companies over $1 billion in annual revenue. So the small and medium-sized companies don't have to worry about it. I launched a training program, which is still available on the Boston Strategies website called RevChain, which helps companies like establish their basis for scope 3 measurement and other reporting. But there isn't really a single technology that helps with that. And I think that's where the answer will be. And if we can't find a technology-based solution to simplify that reporting requirement, then it will not survive. And you look at the European requirements for emissions reporting and overall other kinds of reportings of ESG reportings, and they're extraordinarily perfect and extensive, but they're too burdensome, in my opinion. They're just, for companies have to dedicate now probably a few years of professional resources all to try to just comply with that. And that's very, very, if I were Europe, I would have put these legislations into effect like bit by bit and 1 year increments to allow the company. I mean, they're academically, they're perfect, but it's just so much for companies to absorb. And I think in the United States, we have California with active scope 3 reporting requirements. And then we have other states like New York, New Jersey, and there are about 3 others, Illinois and a couple others, that have scope 3 emissions reporting bills pending, and they are still fleshing them out. We have to make it more feasible. And this is the essence of my approach, which is that there's got to be an algorithmic way using AI and some other tools to try to calculate scope 3 emissions to an acceptable level of accuracy that where every company can do it and they can do it at low cost. And I think technology can save scope 3 reporting regulations.
Give me something to hope for, David, over the next 6 months. What are you looking at to give you some hope that we're moving in the right direction? What would give you that indication?
The biggest, when you say we, who do you mean by we?
The consumers, businesses, give me a sense of what we should be looking for.
Right. Well, I actually, one of the conclusions that I came to when I wrote this book, Trump, Trade, and the End of Globalization, was that, we have to solve our internal problems. If we go to uh, a dinner at someone's house and they serve us a lot of food and we get fat, we can't really blame them for serving us too much food, right? We ate the food. And I think in the United States, we have eaten the food for many years, and we've kind of developed a bloated budget, big deficits, uh, a lot of waste. And so there's a lot of attempts to try to solve this, but what will probably come really into effect if we could cut the budget deficit significantly, and it is the debt which is getting out of control, which we can see by the Treasury issuance this week. It's getting to almost a tipping point because I studied this back at Wharton. I mean, you can run extraordinarily high deficits and it's not going to hurt you. But we're in the stratosphere. So it's affecting our credit rating, which was recently downgraded. It's going to affect our interest rates because we now owe so much debt we owe so much interest on that
Right.
debt every year. So we've got to reduce our deficit. We've got to reduce the cost of healthcare and our other structural costs in this country, which are 2 times, 3 times the cost of other countries, all other countries. So in my opinion, we have to look at kind of cutting back making some structural changes. And there are 10 recommendations I made in that book that we need to do. Now, on the corporate side, those are kind of political things which are difficult to control. On the corporate side, I think we have to stay nimble and agile and ready to respond in a way that we never thought of before. The clients and the companies the group project companies that my students are working on, they study agility, they study resilience, and we actually have methodologies, like serious methodologies. So I think any company that can't define supply chain agility or supply chain resilience or supply chain risk, if they can't define those things using some numbers, then they need to get to a different place with their supply chain flexibility. You have to be you get what you measure, and if we're going to continue to use sort of buzzwords and about supply chain agility and not really measure it and not really manage it, we're going to suffer through these turbulent seas. And so I would start measuring it. And I gave a talk to the NACD, the National Association of Corporate Directors, recently, and I had a checklist, which I'd be happy to offer to anybody, on resilience and security and everything. And we have to get beyond the qualitative to quantitative and manage it. And I teach lean and with some very interesting people and speakers and practitioners. You have to be able to turn on a dime. And the closer we can get as companies to turning on a dime, having backup options, having a flexible supply chain, it's like speaking multiple languages. It's like being multilingual. So it's difficult to get to that level of agility, but it can be very essential in these current times.
No, absolutely, David. I couldn't agree with you more. A lot of the recommendations you have should have been, implemented years ago, and then you would see the muscle memory that our professionals are exercising today. David, I'm going to put a note on my calendar for about 6 months from now to come back to you and say, all right, how did we do relative to where we were back in June? I can't thank you enough, David.
I look forward to it. Thank you, Abe.
All the best.
All right, take care. You too. Bye.